It was 1816, and the French frigate, the Medusa, had run aground off the coast of Africa. 147 people are forced onto a makeshift raft. What would follow is a nightmare fueled by starvation and survival. For 2 weeks, they would float on the open sea. Those who would make it would barely cling to their lives. It was only weeks earlier that the vessel had set sail for Senegal under the command of Captain Hugues de Chaumareys, a man woefully unqualified for the task. His orders were clear: safely deliver soldiers, officials, and settlers to the West African colony of Senegal, which was a French-controlled territory at that time. Unfortunately for him, hubris would catch up. His blind arrogance would seal the fate of the 147 people on board. Completely ignoring the advice of more experienced officers, Chaumareys recklessly steers the ship into treacherous waters. And now, here they were, stranded in the open sea. Amongst them, the ship's carpenter, Jean-Charles, would spend the next 2 weeks trying to hold the raft together. And Henry Savigny, whose knowledge of anatomy could do nothing to prevent what was coming. The raft would creak and groan and whine under the weight of the 147 on board, as if the ocean itself was waiting to swallow them up. What the crew would face over the next 2 weeks is a depiction of what humans can do when they're pushed to the absolute brink of survival. As we leave the crew hopelessly drifting in the sea, I just want to take a second to welcome everyone back. I'll be releasing a full-length episode every 2 weeks on Wednesday, and a shorter episode in between. If you like great mysteries and amazing stories, consider hitting subscribe to stay notified of our newest episodes. Thank you, and let's move on. So, the voyage of the Medusa began with a lot of optimism, even though this thing was completely doomed to fail from the start. It was 1816, and France had just emerged from the Napoleonic Wars. It was eager to re-establish its influence in West Africa. The Medusa was part of a fleet sent to Senegal to assert essentially French colonial power. And on board there were soldiers, officials, settlers, and crew. There was more than 400 people in total. And all of them were crammed into a boat meant to carry guns for war, and only about 300 people. The problem, however, wasn't just the overcrowding. The Medusa was captained by Hugues de Chaumareys, a man with little experience at sea. I guess if you're going to fail upwards. I guess in this guy's case until he ends up failing downwards, but anyway, having spent much time in the Napoleonic era in exile due to his kind of royalist ties, Chaumareys hadn't captained a ship in over 20 years. Yet here he was, at the helm of a critical mission, navigating a dangerous route with outdated maps. Now, if this guy doesn't sound like someone working for the government, I don't know who would. So for the first few days, the journey progresses completely uneventfully. It's just a regular old trip. But soon, whispers of misdirection start to spread among the crew. The crew don't exactly have a lot of faith, it sounds like, in the captain, and they're starting to question whether they're even on the right route. More experienced officers and navigators became increasingly alarmed by Chaumareys' decisions to sail close to the African coast, where sandbanks and shallow rocks lurked and were a constant danger to the ship. His refusal to listen not only shocked them, it completely eroded any trust that they had left in him. And then came a fateful decision on July 2, 1816. Chaumareys, in an attempt to reach Senegal as quickly as possible, ignored multiple warnings and pushed the ship forward straight into something called the Bank d'Arguin, a vast, treacherous sandbank off the coast of what would be modern-day Mauritania. In an instant, the ship jolts to a halt, lodged firmly in the sand, completely immobilized. Panic begins to ripple through the crew and passengers. So it's really important to note here that they were about 35 miles off the mainland, and the sandbank where they crashed was completely desolate. Even from the height of, say, the ship's mast, you'd be completely unable to see the mainland itself because of the curvature of the earth. The sandbank itself is very inhospitable, whether it's due to the rising tides or the lack of resources. The point being, it's not the kind of place you'd want to be stuck. For days, they tried to free the ship. It was hopeless. Supplies were dwindling, it was hot, there was no sign of rescue, and it became abundantly clear to everyone on that ship there was a need for drastic action. Now keep in mind, this is the 1800s, the coast is clearly not populated, they're truly out there by themselves. So yes, there might be sand under their boat, but all I've got is salt water and next to no rations on a ship that's too small for everybody, so this quickly becomes a dire situation dealing with starvation, hunger, human psychology, and of course the fact that everybody on board probably wanted to lynch the captain. It's at this point that the decision is made to abandon the ship. But here's where the first act of betrayal starts to unfold. There wasn't enough lifeboats for everyone. Okay, this is a story as old as time. You see this in almost every shipwreck story. It doesn't seem to be a problem that humans are capable of figuring out. There's never going to be enough lifeboats. Don't expect there to be one for you. Bring a life jacket on your cruise, folks. So in an attempt to save themselves, the officers and wealthier passengers take the lifeboats, leaving the lower ranking crew and the poor passengers to fend for themselves. So what they're left to do essentially is disassemble the ship and build a raft for the 147 people that end up being left behind. It was a desperate last-ditch effort to escape the Medusa, who was slowly being battered against that sandbar, slowly falling apart, leaving a crew stranded without food or water. So they begin to disassemble it. They form a makeshift raft out of all the pieces of floating material, wood, you name it. So the raft was set afloat. So as the officers and the rich people sat in their lifeboats, they were going to essentially try and either guide the raft and pull it as much as they could until they could all reach an area where they could at least go get help. So they sat comfortably in the lifeboats where these people are like basically getting soaked and barely floating in some salt water. I couldn't imagine how crappy that would be out there. Anyhow, but unfortunately for the people on the raft, the officers decide that things were progressing too slow and the raft was just dragging everyone else down. So they cut the ropes and completely untethered the 147 people, leaving them to drift helpless into the ocean, completely abandoned to the whims at sea. The only thing that could control their movement was essentially the wind and the currents of the sea. There were shouts of disbelief and cries of betrayal ringing out from the raft, screaming obscenities at the officers, but soon the lifeboats would disappear over the horizon. The survivors, who were now adrift on the raft, which in itself was barely seaworthy, were no longer part of any rescue plan. They were literally left for dead. The raft would soon become a literal floating hell, where danger lurked not only in the ocean, but from the men beside you. This is probably the start of where the psychological decay happened, being betrayed by people that were supposed to be their leaders, completely breaking down any chances that these people had to come together as a functional group. So the raft itself, I mentioned earlier, this thing is really hastily constructed and it's not likely to last too long. And everybody on board knows that. From the moment that the ropes were cut and the lifeboats disappeared over the horizon, people that were left realized that they were probably not going to survive this. Now, crammed with 147 desperate people, not only was the raft barely holding together, it was packed. There was no space on this thing. And slowly, in the first few hours, as panic begins to set in, people are moving about, the raft became wildly unstable, often dipping and swaying with every wave. Salt water continuously washed over each of the survivors, soaking them to the bone. It quickly became apparent that with no provisions, no food, no water, they weren't going to last long. Now, Savigny had a lot of medical knowledge. He understood the dire situation that everyone was facing with dehydration, lack of food, and psychologically. He did what he could to offer medical aid to those in need and kept a grim count of everyone starting to succumb to either starvation or dehydration. Now, Jean-Charles, a carpenter with practical skills, took it upon himself to try and ensure that the raft would stay afloat. He was constantly adjusting and repairing the fragile structure. Yet, even though they seemed to be the only two trying to help the others, any leadership or any ability they had to hold everyone together was super fragile. A lot of people are already growing weaker, and in desperation, they begin to drink the seawater, only driving them into further dehydration. Now, I'm sure a lot of you know this, but like drinking salt water is a big no. It's a common thing you hear in kind of survival stories, but salt water will completely throw off not only your electrolytes and probably make you throw up, but it's also going to cause you to flush any water you do have in your system out. So bad idea if you're ever in that situation. And people start dropping dead of dehydration. All of a sudden, complete chaos breaks out on the raft. The fights broke out over the smallest scraps of rainwater, cloth, you name it. Those who had once tried to maintain order were now physically too weak. In the midst of the chaos, a horrifying decision was made. They would eat each other. At first, it was said that the dead were consumed only to stay alive, but soon it became more sinister. Some survivors began eyeing the weakest among them, ready to strike at the moment they showed any signs of weakness. Essentially, the moral boundaries that had once governed their behavior began to completely dissolve. Leadership had fully broken down, and the raft became a place of literal primal survival. John Charles, still trying to hold on to some semblance of leadership, attempted to keep the raft together. But even he wasn't immune to the psychological strain. It now seemed to be every man for himself, and they were all stuck on a raft with 100 plus other people who wanted to eat them. So I can't help but imagine that the chaos and the desperation to start eating each other or killing other passengers to eat them wasn't fueled by the drinking of the seawater, which would have completely messed up their cognitive functioning and could even cause them to go into delirium. It's crazy to think that in a matter of days that you can get to the point where you're actually like starting to eat your shipmates, or even like contemplating killing them as they did in this case. Any sign that they were showing weakness, illness, like essentially, oh, we're going to be the nice people. We're going to put you out of your misery just so we can eat you. Like you get a little bit of hangnail. The next thing you're turned into like steak tartare and I don't know. Who knows what kind of recipes they had. But yeah, it just happened so quick. That's the part that really freaks me out. To give you context of how quick this is happening, by the 12th day, the raft was a vision of like complete despair. The 147 who initially boarded, only 15 people were still alive. Now, I just want to note that doesn't mean that all those people were eaten. Most probably died from the dehydration aspect. But the bodies began to pile up, and now the raft was a mess of bloated, decaying, and essentially rotting bodies and flesh. The ones that did survive were little more than skeletons. Their skin burned from the sun and cracked from the salt water. Their lips were dry and bleeding. They could barely speak. The psychological toll had reduced people to just shells of their former selves, completely driven mad by hunger, thirst, and I think just the fact that everyone's cannibalizing everyone around you is enough to drive you mad. It just draws such a parallel. Like I told the story of Shackleton from like with this, which would happen about 50 years later. And this similar dire circumstances, way more probably dire than what these people were actually in. And it just goes to show you the difference like good leadership can make in keeping people together in a situation like this. Now, mind you, we're talking about hundreds of people as opposed to a crew of 28. But you look at people that survived, 3 years in the Antarctic, and you're here 2 weeks. And literally, of the 147 people, 2 of them are dead within 12 days. Fucking wild. So now we're at this point of desperation for the 15 survivors. They must be thinking there's about zero chance they're getting out of this alive. But as the men teetered on the edge of life and death, all of a sudden, a sight would appear that seemed almost impossible. It was day 13, and on the horizon, a small speck. It was a sail. The survivors could hardly believe their eyes. They were too weak to even stand or wave. Slowly the ship approaches, revealing itself as the Argus, a brig sent out to search for the Medusa. The relief was completely overwhelming, though the men were too exhausted to fully express it. The rescuers pulled the emaciated survivors on board. For them, the ordeal was over, but the mental scars, the trauma, would change their entire lives. Only 15 people of the 147 would survive, and each one of these 15 men descended into the absolute depths of human suffering and somehow survived. It was said the crew of the Argus was absolutely shocked with what they found. When they pulled the 15 remaining men off the decaying raft, they were met with sights and smells that defied description. The bloated bodies, the survivors barely recognizable as human. Once aboard the Argus, Savigny and Jean Charles were provided with lots of water and food. It was days before they could actually consume it. Now, a common syndrome that happens with survivors after incidents like this is they have something called refeeding syndrome. And it basically means that you have to reintroduce food slowly, because if you end up drinking and eating too quickly, it can shock your body system and throw everything out of whack and kill you. The survivors returned to France with tales of betrayal, tales of cannibalism, and absolutely impossible Survival. The betrayal by their captain became a national scandal. Captain Hugues de Chaumareys, whose incompetence led to the shipwreck, was court-martialed and found guilty of abandoning his crew. However, despite the enormity of his failure, he was sentenced to just 3 years in prison, a slap on the wrist that only fueled public outrage. The survivors, Savigny and Courard, detailed the horrors of the raft in their writings, which completely shocked the French public. These accounts ended up being widely published, ensuring that the government could not suppress the truth about what happened. This event became the symbol of a leadership failure and a damning reflection on the monarchy's mismanagement. The public was so moved by this story that it became immortalized, at least for the time. And there was even a monumental painting done to represent the story called The Raft of Medusa, done in 1819 by an artist, Théodore Géricault. And it's said that this painting, if you're on YouTube, you can see it on the screen, that this painting captures the precise moment when the survivors spotted the Argus, blending realism with emotional depth. The painting was a haunting representation of the last flicker of hope the people had on that raft, and it was a political statement, a condemnation of those in power who had abandoned their people, because this was truly another story of those without means being abandoned by those with means. And I think the story is more important than ever, because I see division everywhere in Canada where I am, and I see it in the US as well. And what's super fucking important for everyone to remember is you gotta come together when shit gets tough, because the politicians, the leaders, the officers are not going to be there for you, but you and the people beside you will be. Anyhow, I'm glad I got to share this story, and it's a dark one. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks again, and we'll be back next Wednesday. I'm trying to think what I'm going to release. Let me know in the comments. I'm torn between releasing a story on the Lost Franklin expedition and torn between releasing a story, a really good story actually, I think, on Project Montreal, kind of the Canadian MK Ultra. So if you got any thoughts on that, drop me a comment and we'll talk soon.